Hello there pretty people of the internet and welcome back to my channel. My name is Annika and today I'm going to talk about a few of my favorite techniques for memorizing materials faster and better. I used to have a very hard time remembering stuff and recalling it on tests, and I felt like it really inhibited my ability to get the grades that demonstrated what I knew. So I watched a lot of YouTube videos, I read a lot of books and articles, and I found a few memorization techniques that really work for me. Before I jump into my favorite tips and techniques, I just want to make sure that you'll understand that memorization is just one part of learning. In order to memorize better, you really have to have a good understanding of what you're trying to memorize. Your long-term memory is an important part of memorizing stuff, and that requires rest and time, so I just wanted to get that out there before we get started. My first memorization technique is rhythm, and not necessarily like a full song, although that might be helpful to some people. I'm talking about rhythm in words and sentences. For me, this is very helpful when I'm trying to remember how many of something I need. For instance, if I need to remember how many exceptions there are to revocation in contracts law, then I know in the word revocation we have 4 syllables and there are 4 exceptions. This is like a very limited technique, but sometimes I just need something quick just to be able to remember how many elements I need. And using rhythm is very helpful for me. The next one is acronyms. I think you all know this. It's where you take the first letter of each word and you turn it into a different word. Acronyms work when the sentence work, when you can make a word out of the first letters. It's often if you have like a certain list or elements. Sometimes it works if you need things in order, but most of the time it works if you can move things around. To go back to contracts law, I know that the statute of frauds apply to my legs. That's an acronym for marriage, year, land, executors, goods over $500, and sure to ship. Acronyms is like one of the really big memorization techniques. I think it can be helpful. It also has its limitations. I think often when you want to use an acronym but it doesn't work, like you can't really make a word or a sentence from those letters, I think you should turn to the next memorization technique, which is mnemonic devices. This is a similar technique, but you take the first letter of every word you need to remember and then you turn it into a sentence. Here's an example of using mnemonic devices from contracts law.
I just finished like a unit on contracts law for my bar study. That's why all these examples are from contracts law.
Love for dogs, treat every rover terrifically. That is a mnemonic device reminding me of what I need to look for in a contracts question. I need to write this down. I can't really do it from my head, but even if I walk into an exam, if I get a piece of paper, I will just write it down and then I have it. So I don't need to necessarily physically have the thing with me all the time because I remember the mnemonic device, but I will have to write it down so that I can write out the correct things underneath each, if that makes sense. My next technique is visualization, and this one is big for me. I have a very hard time just remembering words or meanings. I usually make like a little doodle or something visual, like an image, and attach it to what I need to remember. It's often very simple things. This one has a lot more to do with like common sense and attaching what you're trying to memorize to things you already know. Visualization often involves you having to take the first thing that comes to your mind, make it move, make it a little silly, maybe even make it make noise or say stuff. Don't make it say the important information. The thing itself needs to be the important information, but you can sort of make it say things that will make you remember it more. The final technique is also like the biggest technique, and that is the memory palace. You might have heard of this before. I've talked about it before. It's sort of very popular and sort of like not used at all. And this has to do with picking like a palace, so like a house, a building you're familiar with, or a route. I often like to use a route. And in different locations you put things you need to memorize. This can be used for memorizing numbers. I will link a very cool video down below showing that. It can be used to remember timelines, sizes, anything in order, anything you just need to remember. Here's your fair warning. This technique can be a little comprehensive. It might not be the best place to start, but if you need to remember a lot of information, this one is great. I personally like to use it if I need to remember things in a certain order. For instance, the size of countries. Although I don't think you need to use the memory palace all the time to remember stuff, I think it brings with it a few important like key nuggets that you can use to remember other things. For one is the visualization I just talked about. how if you make a series of connecting events using visual images, it can be a lot easier to remember things like a sequence of words that otherwise appear to be very random can be connected if you make little animations, sort of like interacting with one another, leading from word to word to word. Memorization becomes a lot easier if you try to connect your new knowledge or the knowledge you're trying to memorize with information you already know. For instance, if you're trying to learn a new language, take the words and try to break them down into like small sounds or things that are already familiar to you. Traditional flashcards can be good for memorizing, but I think just like reading and testing yourself like back and forth without doing anything more to engage your brain and trying to remember the information isn't super helpful. It's a little bit of a waste of time. It works for certain things, but for most things, there are better ways to remember things quicker and smarter. I think you can take your flashcards and try to apply a mix of these different memorization techniques to that. Also, please remember that you do not need to use memorization techniques for everything you try to remember. Certain things you remember, just leave it at that. Certain things will be easier if you break it down into categories or groups. For instance, here we have a card from criminal law about major crimes and requisite mens rea. Mens rea means the requisite mental state you need to be in. This is a heavily tested thing on the bar exam, so I need to remember all of this. Now, instead of me sitting here and trying to remember all of this, I will go, okay, so the biggest category is specific intent, and it has 11 crimes listed under it. When I had a lecture on this, I was giving a mnemonic device to try to remember it. That didn't work for me. I didn't make it didn't make sense to me, I didn't remember it. So instead, I just break it down into 4 different categories. I am grouping the different crimes together in ways that make sense to me. First, I have inchoate crimes. Then I have 3 crimes related to taking people's stuff, 3 crimes related to honesty or dishonesty, and then I have assault and first-degree murder, which I just remember because they're like kind of your worst crimes, so you should need specific intent to commit them. Now, how about the rest? There's still a lot of different crimes under this. While I remember malice just has 2 crimes related to it, common law murder and arson, then I know that general intent has the rest, unless it's a strict liability thing like administrative stuff, statutory rape. So I didn't necessarily have to use a special memorization technique to remember this because I relied on my general knowledge, things I already knew, common sense. If you can remember things without a memorization technique, that's fine. Don't force it. You don't need to spend the time and come up with things to remember things you already remember. In order to effectively memorize something, you need to both remember the information, so like input into your brain, and then being able to recall, so pulling that information out of your brain. You should do recall exercises fairly regularly. I think the best way to do this is to sort of increase the time between each time you recall it as you get better. So for every time you recall information, try to go a little longer between the next time you try to recall information. And be real with yourself. If you are only able to recall 9 out of 10, then you only know 9 out of 10. Make sure that you use a different memorization technique, or maybe just mix it up a little to try to remember that last 10th. Learning is a process and memorization is a process. Getting things wrong when you're practicing is good. It means that you can really figure out what you know, what you don't know, and it often sticks with you. We often remember our failures more than our successes, so don't beat yourself up if you get things wrong as you practice. That's the point of practice. Practice makes progress. The things that you forget when you're practicing memorization will tell you where you're lacking, what you need to do to remember better, and most likely, if you mess up a few times on the same thing, you're gonna remember that down the line because you remember sort of like that thing of getting it wrong or the embarrassment or the, oh, can't believe I would forget that, and then you remember it better down the line. These techniques will take a little bit of time, they will take practice, and they require that you really apply yourself to what you're trying to memorize. Memorization is not a passive experience, you have to really actively engage your brain. Try to mix up the different techniques to figure out what works for you and when. As always, I would also recommend writing things out by hand, pen to paper, when you're trying to memorize and recall information. This goes like with muscle memory and like the brain body connection, and I think it just works a lot better when you try to memorize rather than just reading stuff off a screen. One of my favorite reasons to use these memorization techniques is because you will remember the information for a long time. By spending a little bit more time on the front end, you can remember things for longer and not have to constantly go back and relearn and re-remember. That can be very important for those of you who are just starting the IB and need to remember a lot of information for an exam 2 years down the line, or those of you who are in law school who have a bar exam coming up when you're done. If you put in this little extra time now, you will remember it when you come back to the material again later, saving you time down the line. So anyways, those are my favorite techniques for how to memorize material faster, better, and for longer. Please let me know in the comments down below what your favorite memorization techniques are and if you use any of these. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye!